Okay, let us get started. I'm delighted that you join us today. My name is Iris Bonet. I'm on the faculty here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I co-direct the Women in Public Policy program. So thank you for joining us for our spring research seminar on Make Work Fair. This seminar features a number of researchers working on important topics like the one today on pay equity. In fact, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Ricardo Perez-Truglia, who's presenting Pay Transparency, Salary Negotiations, and the Gender Pay Gap. It has become a hot topic. Ricardo and I just talked a little bit about it in recent years, with many US states introducing different versions of the policy and many countries around the world trying out different versions of pay transparency. So there's lots to be learned today. Ricardo is an economics professor at UCLA at the Anderson School of Management, where he's been very successful. And he's also just received a Sloan Research Fellowship, which recognizes outstanding early career faculty with the potential to revolutionize their field of study. For those of you who are following along in our book, Make Work Fair, this is very related to chapter 5, which is called Transparency for Accountability. In that chapter, we feature more research on other types of transparency questions, including on representation, but also, of course, in terms of pay equity. So Ricardo will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll have some time for questions. Please feel free to raise your virtual hand or put your questions into the chat. And with that, let me warmly welcome Ricardo. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Iris, for the very kind introduction, and especially for the invitation to talk a little bit about my research and the research of others in this wonderful seminar. So what I will be doing today is not talking about one specific research project or paper. I will be more or less talking about a selection of a handful of papers that I find interesting, some of them by me and co-authors, but some of them by other research teams. I'm not trying to be very comprehensive in the sense of covering every reason of pay transparency, because there is a lot. What I'm trying to do today is sort of like give you a summary of what I think are the most important studies or the most important findings, and also some food for thought for what we still need to learn, and so on and so forth. So as Iris was mentioning, there has been an upward trend in terms of pay transparency legislation, both in the United States and in the rest of the world. And this is not only a policy move that is making transparency greater and greater. It's also the case that some market movers are sort of like helping with transparency. So if you think about figuring out what you're worth, figuring out how much you should get paid for a particular position, no matter whether it is a professor, a software developer, or a bank teller, maybe 20 years ago, you had to talk to a lot of people, and it was tough to collect some information. These days, you can go to websites like, for example, Glassdoor, Blind, Levels FYI, and so on and so forth, where they crowdsource a lot of data, and you can see very nice infographics, okay, based on your experience, your position, the company, the region, we think you're worth this much or that much, and so on and so forth. But government policies are doing their part too. For example, at the state level in the United States, there are some legislation that affects both state employees and also federal employees, mandating the disclosure of their salaries. So for any state employee, there are websites, and the website may change from state to state, where you can pretty much look up the pay of any person working in that position, and a lot of information about that position, and so on and so forth. I actually, with the help of like a few students, we put up a tool in case you're interested called prof-salary.com. Prof-salary.com. It's a website that uses all of these public level available data to create a kind of infographic to try to understand like pay for economics professors. So that's one application of the data, for example. There has been some legislation trying to better protect the right of workers to discuss salaries. Some states is still the case that you can get fired because if you are caught like discussing your salary with someone else, that can be part of your contract. So when you sign a contract with a company, they can say, hey, this is sort of an NDA clause. You are not supposed to tell your coworkers or anyone inside or outside the company how much you're getting paid. So if you are caught doing so, that could be a legitimate reason for firing you. Whereas in other states and a growing list of states in the United States, now workers are protected. They know that they can discuss salary and pay with their coworkers, and the companies cannot do anything to punish them. Another recent policy is the salary history ban. So whenever you get an offer from a new employer, it used to be the case that they will ask you a question along the lines of how much are you currently making or how much you made at your previous job, and you had to report a number, and they will use that number in deciding how much to offer you. Now they're not allowed to do that. They can still do slight variation of that, which is that they can ask you a question about what are your salary expectations. But even in that case, according to the new law, you don't have any obligation to answer that question. So what you can say, what you should do, at least according to economic theory, is say, you know what, I want to learn about, how much value I can bring to the company. So if you're okay, like please come up with a number and we can discuss it. So you don't have to be the first mover. In New York, California, Colorado, many other states are also pushing pay range disclosure laws. So anytime that they post a position in a job board, the companies are obligated to include information on the pay range. It doesn't have to be the exact salary, but at least some informative signal on what are the expected, salaries that you could get in that particular position. And this is just for the United States. If you look at other countries, there are lots of transparency policies that have been enacted in the last 20 years. In particular, some of them are, and one of them in Denmark that we'll be talking about shortly, they are directly about pay equity. So, for example, in Denmark, there is this law that obligates firms to disclose to their own employees what's the pay gap by position in their own company. So not only they have to be transparent about the specific salaries or the average salaries or anything like that, they also have to be transparent about how much men and women are making at that same company or in the same position, and so on and so forth. So this is just a very brief overview of what's happening with policy. If you want to see more details, I can recommend that you read this review paper that I wrote recently called The Effects of Pay Transparency, a Brief Review. And there you will see a more comprehensive list of examples of policies, both in the United States and other countries as well. If you go to my website, you will see a link to the PDF of the document. It's not gated or anything like that. Okay, so in theory, one of the reasons why we pass this type of legislation, or the way in which the policymakers are talking about it, is not that they want more transparency only on the basis of principles, like we should be more transparent as society, and so on and so forth. A lot of them are pushing for transparency legislation precisely because they think it will benefit workers or it will have an effect on some other important policy goals. So some of these transparency policies are motivated by, okay, we think that this is going to reduce the gender pay gap. Others is, we think this is going to give workers more leverage in negotiations and it's going to increase their salaries and so on and so forth. That's in theory. In practice, there are countless examples of policies that end up backfiring or that they don't work at all and so on and so forth. So it's our responsibility as academics, as researchers, to try to measure exactly what happened after the introduction of these different policies. So what I wanted to talk about is a little bit some examples of what the effects of those policies are. Before moving to the specific policies, let me take a step back. I want to give you an example for why we think transparency, or one of the reasons why we think transparency policies may move the needle. They may have an effect on what employers and employees do. And to motivate this, I won't use an experiment with humans, but I will show this experiment with our close relatives, the capuchin monkeys. So this is some fascinating research by Sarah de Brosnas and Frank de Waal, in which they train some monkeys to do some simple tasks. They just give a token to the monkeys, and the monkeys have to give them back to the experimenter. If they give him back, they get a reward. If they don't give it back, they don't get anything. After doing this experiment for a long time, they came up with a slight variation of it that was fascinating. So what they did is they put monkeys side by side. You can see that there is a monkey here to the left and a monkey to the right. And they would play the same game with both monkeys at the same time, but they did the following variation. They said to the monkey on the left, as a reward for completing the task, we're gonna pay this monkey with cucumbers, and to the monkey to the right, for the exact same task, we're gonna pay this monkey with grapes. So I don't know if you knew this, but monkeys love grapes, and they are not such big fans of cucumbers because the grapes have very high sugar content. So in a sense, what they're trying to do is they are trying to replicate the workplace where there is not equal pay for equal work. The tasks are the same, but the reward is much higher for one monkey versus the other. So I will show you this video sort of summarizing the results of the experiments, which is what happens when this monkey on the left, because this is transparent, realizes that the monkey to the right is doing the same task but getting a higher reward. So let's see what happens.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
So after the monkey saw that the other monkey was getting a higher reward for the same task, the monkey just refuses to do the task, and then for like going forward, like doesn't want to participate in the experiment anymore. So this is a way of saying that we are social beings, we care a lot about fairness, and then when you are going to increase transparency, what's going to happen is that if things are unfair, people are going to find out and they're going to have a negative reaction to it. So in a sense, that's one of the reasons why we think that being transparent is important. If there are any inequities, if people are being unfair, then they're going to be held accountable. So let me tell you a little bit about this study that we did with one of my co-authors, Professor Zoe Cullen from HBS, where we did an experiment kind of similar to the one with the monkeys that I showed you before, but rather than using monkeys, we use human beings. So it was in collaboration with a firm, large financial institutions, where people are working and they have peers. So for example, you could be a bank teller and you're working with other bank tellers in your same branch. And also you have bosses. So if you're a bank teller, your boss may be the head of the branch of the bank where you're working, or if you are a junior researcher, your boss could be a senior researcher of the chief economist and so on and so forth. So we did this experiment where we provided information with the information experiment. We provided information to these employees about what their peers were making and also what their bosses were making. And then what we did is we tracked what happened afterwards. A week later, a month later, 3 months later, what's going on in your work life, how many hours, minutes, and seconds are you spending in the office, how many emails are you sending, what's going on with your sales, and so on and so forth. We can see whether the effort of these individuals is going up or down as a result of the information that we provide. So the experiment is a bit more complicated than what I'm going to describe, but I think that this simplified version is enough to give you the bottom line. So imagine that you have an employee who underestimates how much their peers are working. So this employee thinks that he or she is getting paid about average relative to the peers, the other bank tellers in the branch. But in reality, the peers are getting paid 10% more or 15% more and so on and so forth. So what we effectively did in this experiment is at some point, in a survey, we flip the coin, and with probability 50%, we tell you, okay, we can share some information with you. You are being underpaid by 15% relative to other people in the same position in the same branch. And in the control group, with a 50% probability, we will tell you didn't get selected by the coin flip, so you don't get to see any information. So you continue to think that you're paid the same as the average worker. When we compare afterwards what happened, what we find is that there are significant differences between the employees who found out that they get paid less than their coworkers and the employees who didn't find out. The employees who found out that they are being underpaid relative to peers, they do worse across all of the different metrics. So when we ask subjective questions like, well, they're satisfied with their job or their pay, they're less likely to say that they are satisfied. And when we look at their behaviors, the number of hours that they spend in the office, the emails that they send, or how much they sell, they tend to do worse in all of those metrics as well. So much like the monkeys in the first experiment that I showed you, they saw that there was some unfairness going on, or what they thought was unfair, and their natural reaction was to be pissed off and to work less hard as a result. We also did a variation of this experiment, but rather than looking at the peers, we gave information about the bosses. So what happens when you find out that your boss gets paid a lot more than you thought? And this difference can be a lot greater. So for peers, worst case scenario, you find out that you are paid 15% below average. So typically peers would get paid more or less the same. Whereas for bosses, the differences could be massive. You could find out that your boss is paid like twice as much as you, or 5 times as much as you, or in some cases, 20 times as much as you. So what we find is that when we do the same experiment, finding out that the boss gets paid a lot more than you actually has positive effects. People seem to be more likely to stick around, they seem to work harder and so on and so forth, which sort of, makes the point that when we say equal pay for equal work, we need to fix the equal work part. So what people really found unfair wasn't that someone who does something entirely different than you was getting more money. What really seems to be pissing people off is that even though we have the same responsibilities, even though they have the same role, I'm getting paid less than you. And I will get back to this difference like later on in the talk, but it turns out to be very important to try to think through what the potential effects of pay transparency may be. Okay, so now we go back to all of these transparency policies, and you could come up with reasons why increasing transparency may reduce the gender pay gap. So if you think about our study in this bank, in this financial institution, you could think that, well, if you are forcing employers to be more transparent, they're going to do backward induction, and they're going to say, well, if I'm paying, let's say, women less than men for the same position, the women are going to find out, they're going to be very angry and demotivated, they're going to leave the company and so on and so forth. So I want, anticipating that, given that I need to be transparent, I may want to, pay them more equally. So there may be other reasons why transparency could have positive effects. So for example, if you think about the role of negotiations, if for whatever reason female employees are not as informed as male employees, they may have less leverage when it comes to salary negotiations. By increasing transparency, now everyone gets to see the same information, and then female employees can use that to their advantage to just catch up with the male employees in salary negotiations. And you could also think of transparency, not only the transparency between the employer and the employee, but a broader transparency. So what if your clients were to find out that you're paying your employees, the female employees, less than the male employees? Maybe your clients are going to be pissed off and they're not going to buy from you anymore. So maybe the reason why you want to change your behavior is because you are concerned of those reputational effects. Could be among investors or clients or regulators and so on and so forth. So there are lots of reasons why you are forcing firms to be more transparent. They may want to change their behavior. There are 2 seminal studies trying to look at what are in practice the effects of pay transparency. The first one that I will tell you about is a study that took place in Denmark. The second one, a study that took place in Canada. These studies came out at about the same time and got published at about the same time as well. One thing that I find fascinating is that the results seem to line up pretty well in terms of the timing, the effect sizes, who gets affected, and so on and so forth. So the first study, the one about Denmark, they look at this policy in Denmark that require firms to disclose to their own employees some salary statistics by gender. It's not clear how this works in practice, but how it should work is that you should do things like, for example, compute the average pay within specific positions. Let's say for a tech company, you could compute among my software developers, how much am I paying the female software developers, how much am I paying the male software developers, and report to the employees, okay, these are the two numbers, so this is the gap between the two, and so on and so forth. And to study the effects of this policy, they use two sources of identification. One is the timing of the policy, that the policy was enacted in 2016, so they can compare what happens to the gender pay gap in 2007 and 2008 versus 2006 and 5 and 4 and so on and so forth. But the other nice feature of the policy for the identification of the causal effects is that the policy only affected a very specific group of firms. There was a threshold that I think it was 30 employees. So if your company had 30 or 31 employees, you were subject to this mandate and you had to do this disclosure, whereas if your firm had 29 or 28 employees, you were not subject to this new policy. So they do a difference in difference design where they're going to compare firms that are right above the threshold versus companies who are right below the threshold, and also the before after the policy was enacted. You can look at the paper for more details, but I can show you one figure that I think summarizes quite well. Their findings, you can see that prior to the enactment of the law, 2005, 4, and 3, both the male employees and the female employees seem to be in similar trends. There are no significant difference between the top panel for male employees and the bottom panel for female employees. But when you look at the post-treatment period, 2006, 7, and 8, what you can see is that the evolution for the salaries of male employees and female employees diverges. It seems to be going down somewhat for male employees and going up somewhat for female employees. So if you do the difference between the two, it looks like the gender pay gap was reduced as a result of the policy. They do some back of envelope calculations, and what they conclude is that this transparency policy for the firms that were affected reduced the gender pay gap by approximately 13%. This doesn't mean that now the size of female employees is 13% higher. What this really means is that there was a, let's say, 6 percentage point difference between the salary of the female employees and male employees in specific positions. So within the software developers, the female developers were getting paid 6% less than the male ones, and that 6% gap was reduced to maybe 5%. So the 13% effect, you should think of it like that. So it's not a huge effect, but it's a significant effect in the right direction. Second study is this study by Baker et al. That takes place in Canada, looking at the mandate to disclose the salaries of faculty in public universities, which in Canada is like all universities are public. So this is the universe of universities. And the identification strategy is quite similar. What they can do is they can see what happened right before and right after the year where this mandate went into effect, but they can also construct a sort of control and treatment group. And the control and treatment group exploits also a very arbitrary threshold that this policy had. So what the policy said is like only salaries above a certain threshold should be subject to this mandate. Salaries below this threshold are kind of protected. You don't have to disclose them. And there was meaningful variation within universities. So for example, at the University of Toronto, if you look at the business school, every single faculty or almost every single faculty was above the threshold. So all of their salaries were made a matter of public record. Whereas if you look at, for example, the sociology department, maybe almost all of the salaries were below the threshold, so the sociology department wasn't affected by the policy. So they can do, again, treatment versus control group before and after the policy for a difference in differences identification. Again, you can look at the paper for details, but this is, I think, one figure that summarizes the finding pretty well. The x-axis is the years relative to a reform, and you can see in the y-axis the log salaries, the average log salaries for men and women in different color. What you can see is that prior to the enactment of the reform, there are sort of parallel trends. The evolution of salary seems to be pretty parallel between men and women, whereas right after the reform, it seems to create a wedge where the evolution of the salaries of women is more positive or less negative than the evolution of the salaries for men. So this seems to be moving in the right direction. It seems to be reducing the gender pay gap. They also do some sort of back of the envelope calculations to try to come to answer the question, what's the bottom line? What's the effect of this policy on the pay gap? And they also find that this transparency law reduced the gender pay gap in between 20 to 40%, depending on the specification that you're choosing. The one in the other study is 13%, but to be fair, there is enough statistical imprecision in this study that probably you cannot reject that the two effects were the same, even though the policies were totally different, even though the settings are totally different, and so on and so forth. Again, to be fair, what they find is that there is a 5% gap at baseline. So if you look at within the business school, the female and the male professors, the female ones were getting paid 5% less on average than the male professors. And what they show is that because of the policy, that gap went down from 5% to only 4%. Okay, so again, it's only a 1% salary bump. It's not a huge effect, but given that this is a very low cost intervention, it's not that it costs a lot of money to enact these transparency laws. It's really like clearly cost effective. Like it's moving the needle in the right direction in a significant way. There are some caveats with this evidence, though. So everything's not as good as you may think at first sight. The first one is that when they break down the effects and they do it separately for men and women, what they show is that in both of these studies, what the transparency seems to be doing is not increasing the female salaries. What it seems to be doing is slowing down the salary growth for the male employees, and it's not slowing it down for the female ones. So in net terms, salaries are actually going down. If you were to look at the average salary, what you would conclude is that the transparency policy was actually slightly bad for the average salary in both of these countries. Okay, so you are making things more equal, but at the same time, you're sort of making the average worker slightly worse off in this context. So there is some sort of equity efficiency trade-off if you are thinking about whether you would recommend these policies or not. There is an excellent paper by Professor Zoe Cullen that I mentioned before with Bobak Paxar-Herson, where they provide a model that can actually rationalize these results that may seem counterintuitive. How come you are forcing companies to be more transparent, yet employees are worse off because of that? And their theoretical argument is that companies are doing backward induction. What was going on is that when there is no transparency and you have an employee coming to you and saying, hey, I want a raise, I want more salary, you can sort of secretly give a raise to that employee only. Nothing happens, it's fine. But when you're being fully transparent, if an employee comes to you and say, hey, I want to be special, I want a raise, you may go, hey, I would love to give it to you because you're a very proactive employee. However, if I give you a raise, because this data is public, everyone else will find out in your team. And next year, everyone will be knocking on my door asking for the same raise. So giving a raise to you will actually turn into giving a raise to everyone. So I'm going to tie my hands. I'm going to tell you, no, I'm not going to give you a raise. So they show that, with the model, the equilibrium effect of transparency could be that salaries go down. And they also have some evidence by doing a study of one of these transparency policies that I mentioned before, this legislation in the US protecting the right of workers to inquire about the salaries of their workers. and they show that consistent with the previous studies, on average, it actually reduced salaries by around 2%. So again, transparency policies seem to be great in the sense that they reduce the gender pay gap. However, on the other hand, they seem to be slightly reducing salaries on average as well. So it's not really a win-win situation. There is a meaningful trade-off that you should think of. The other caveat that I want to stress is that the vast majority, and this is going back to the difference between these horizontal and vertical comparisons that I was mentioning before, the vast majority of the gender pay gap comes from the vertical rather than the horizontal pay inequity. So when you zoom in into a particular company, let's say Google, and you see, okay, let's look at a particular position, L4 software engineers, how much are the female ones getting paid? How much are the male ones getting paid? The differences tend to be rather small, tend to be like 1% or 4% or 5% and so on and so forth. That's sort of the order of magnitude that we see. I'm just making up these numbers. I haven't looked at the data from Google, but in general, when you look at specific companies, specific positions, the gaps between the male employees and the female employees tend to be pretty modest. So what's driving these huge differences when you look at the average salary that women are getting and the average salary that men are getting? The vast majority of that inequality between men and women is coming from differences in the vertical margin. So it's coming from the fact that women are not being promoted at the same rates as men. And this is something that, this is one source of data you can use, but this shows up across the world and across different sectors and so on and so forth. For corporate America, one statistic is that when you look at entry-level jobs, half of them are female. But when you look, as you go up the ranks, you see that the female representation is dropping and dropping and dropping. So if you go up to middle management, it already drops down to 38%. If you go to a C-suite, it goes down to 22%. And if you look at CEOs, only 5%. Back in 2018, only 5% of them were female. More recently, it went up a little bit, but it's still a very low number. So if you were to compute the average salary among all employees, you will see that 95% of the CEOs will be men. Those are going to be making a lot of money, and that's going to create a huge gap in the average salary between the male and the female employees. So one of the limitations that pay transparency policies may have is that what it seems to bother employees the most are these sort of horizontal inequity, people not getting paid the same, not getting the same pay for the equal work, but people don't seem to be nearly as angry about those vertical differences when they find out the male CEO gets paid 100 times more than a random female employee in the company. People seem to be okay with that type of inequality. So for that reason, by just making the data more transparent, by making it more accessible, it may have limited effects on the gender pay gap. That's one limitation that one should keep in mind. Another way of saying this is that transparency policies have the potential to move the needle in the right direction. It's going to fix some of the inequities, but you shouldn't expect it to fix it entirely. There is a huge chunk of inequality that most likely won't be affected by transparency policies, or at least not by the type of transparency policies that we have seen in the recent past. Okay, so I wanted to stop by a second in case anyone has any questions. Let me see. Okay, so I see 2 questions, but I think that there are deeper questions that we should leave for the Q&A. So if anyone has any clarifying question at this point, feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm going to go on.
I will post them, Ricardo, if I see anything that is directly relevant to what because both questions seem to be of a more generic nature.
Exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about in the last 10 minutes, before we go into the Q&A, 5 or 10 minutes, it's about a recent project with 2 of the authors that I mentioned today, Professor Zoe Cullen and Professor Bob Paxar-Coulson, where in this work in progress, we are trying to think about the role of salary negotiations and transparency in negotiations as a potential factor contributing to the gender pay gap. This is a factor that comes up pretty often. So for example, with my MBA students, I do an exercise in the micro class where I show them some data about the gender pay gap of MBA graduates, which is massive. So according to some studies, like right after graduation, the female and the male MBAs are making about the same. But when you look 30 years later or 10 years later, the male MBA graduates are making 80% more than the average female MBA graduate. So there are these huge gaps, and we have this conversation or the exercise that I do in the classes, where it could be coming from, and we talk about the research on the topic. One of the factors that comes every single time is someone will raise a hand and say, it's because women don't negotiate enough or don't negotiate effectively, and so on and so forth. I think this is a concept that was popularized most likely by Sherry Saltman's book, Lean In. But when you actually look after the book came out, all of the research that has been done, the academic research, the findings are kind of mixed. So this is, I don't think there is a lot of consensus in this literature. When we look at, for example, laboratory studies, what's great about them is that it's a controlled setting, so you can actually experiment and like control things. And in laboratory experiments, it looks like women are negotiating less and it's costing them. However, this may not be representative of the population that we really care about. Most of the people who participate in these lab experiments are undergrads. So, at the time that you're an undergrad, you never had a job. Maybe you never had to negotiate anything in your life. So maybe, there could be some gaps that as people get more and more experience, disappear. The other type of data that we have is survey data, where people have done surveys of professionals, for example, and asked them, what about your last offer? Did you negotiate it or not? Was it effective or not? And when we look at that type of data, more like field data about professionals, people with experience, it kind of suggests that the gaps are rather small, that there is not a big gap between the negotiation rates, let's say, between male and female employees. So what we try to do with this paper that we're writing up right now, hopefully, so if you go to my website, you won't see a draft yet, but hopefully it will become available in the next month or so. We try to do an experiment where we get the best of both worlds. We want to do an experiment, but in the field, with like real people who have real jobs and where the stakes are high and their experience and so on and so forth. So we studied salary negotiations with a sample of thousands of tech workers in the US. And what we do is first, we collect a lot of rich data. We survey them at the point where they are in the job market. And we ask them questions like, for example, which offers did you get? And for each of those offers, we ask questions like, well, what was the initial terms? What are the final terms? Did you attempt to negotiate the terms or not? And so on and so forth. So we have really nice panel data on the evolution of the job market and all the way to the end, which offer do you end up taking? And this is a context that may be particularly interesting to study the effect of on the gender pay gap, because it's a context that is very well known for being male dominated. So for example, according to a recent Deloitte report, around 25% of technical tech jobs in the US are only 25% are held by women. And when we look at our own data, we do see some signs that there may be a disadvantage to women. So for example, we look at initial offers, how competitive they are relative to a market benchmark. And we do see that women tend to receive initial offers that are around 6% less competitive than men. And we also see signs, for example, that at baseline in the control group, women are less likely to attempt to negotiate offers, less likely to see compensation gains in the negotiation process, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of suggestive evidence that maybe this is a context where women are doing worse in negotiations. We embedded 2 field experiments into the survey. One where we do a very light touch intervention. We do this message where we try to get people excited about negotiating their offers, and we gave them a lot of factual information for why maybe they should consider negotiating. And we have a more hands-on treatment, which is that we partner with a company that provides coaching, negotiation coaching services. So they match you with a coach who is a very experienced recruiter in the sector that is going to walk you through the whole negotiation process. So they're going to sit with you, have some meetings, and write the emails together, strategize as to, what to do first, and second, how much to ask for, and so on and so forth. So we partner up with them, and the treatment is you get a very deep discount on the service. The service that typically costs $1,200, you can get it for only $250. So in the evidence that we see, we find some suggestive evidence that both treatments that are trying to get people to negotiate more seem to be relatively more effective for women relative to men. One caveat to mention is that because of this is a male-dominated industry, the share of women in the experiment is rather low. Only 19% of them are female. So you have to take some of the results with a grain of salt. But just to give you some examples, here on the left, this is the effect of the information treatment on the probability that people attempt to negotiate an offer. And you can see that for the male employees, there is a positive effect of around 5.8 percentage points. So people who saw this information treatment relative to people in the control group that don't see the treatment are 5.8 percentage points more likely among men. But when we look at the same comparison, but for women, what we find is that an effect that it's also statistically significant, but about 3 times as large in terms of magnitude. So again, nudging people or pushing them to try to negotiate seems to be helpful for both men and women, but it seems to be particularly helpful for women. If instead of thinking about, did you attempt to negotiate the offer, we use a measure which is, did you go through a successful negotiation? Like, did you actually get something in return? Like, did your compensation go up by at least 1%? We find results that are very similar. So you see that for men, there are gains of 4.7%, the probability that you see a compensation improvement, whereas for women, those gains tend to be 3 times as large. We also look at the second treatment, which is the coaching treatment, and we see something similar for men. What we see is that if you get randomly assigned to the coaching treatment, there is no increase in the probability that you negotiate. One way of thinking about that is these are men who negotiate with a coach if they get a deep discount, but they would have negotiated on their own anyways. Whereas for women, we see very different results. What we see is that when women get a discount, they are way more likely, 12 percentage points more likely to negotiate. So these are people who negotiate with a coach, but wouldn't have negotiated on their own. And when we look at the improvement on the offer terms, we see more or less similar results, that for men, there are no effects, like they're equally likely to see an improvement in the terms, whereas for women, we see this big positive effect on the probability that the terms improve. So it looks like in both cases, women were sort of lagging behind. You can see it already over here in the control group at baseline. For men, the probability of attempting to negotiate is 77%, whereas for women it's only 65%. And when they get treated by this treatment, it sort of closes the gap entirely. So you see that the 65% for women goes all the way up to 77%, which matches like the control group for men. So it seems that either of these interventions are quite effective at closing the gap in negotiations. But again, this is preliminary findings. This is work in progress. So you can check out the paper when it comes out and we'll have a lot more details. So that's it for now. I just wanted to leave you all of my contact information. If you have any questions or suggestions, don't hesitate to reach out. I wanted to hear your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. This was fantastic and also really well presented. So very, very, very helpful for all of us. So I'm going to start maybe at the bottom with some of the questions. So Shreya asks whether you found any differences in feelings about vertical inequality across countries or cultures. But maybe your question is even broader, you know, are there cross-cultural differences in how people respond to pay inequity, whether vertical or maybe horizontal even?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. My best guess is that yes, there must be big cultural differences. The country that we were studying, it didn't have enough variation. It's not that there were 2 groups with different cultures or anything like that to be able to do some heterogeneity analysis. But if you look at the paper, there is a whole section dedicated pretty much to this discussion, which are the cultural factors or the values that could sort of mediate the effects. What we posit is that one of the things that probably matters the most is the feelings of meritocracy. So this was a very competitive financial institution where when you talk to employees, there was this perception that if you work really hard, you're going to make it, you're going to get promoted. So in a context like that, if you find out that your boss is getting paid a ton of money, that's sort of good news, because it means that if you work hard yourself, you can get that paycheck 5 years in the future. And we do show some evidence along those lines. So we show that when you learn about a boss, that statistically speaking, based on like past data, you can get promoted too. There is a high chance that you could get promoted there. It's a realistic aspiration. That's where we see all of the positive effects. When we are telling the bank teller about how much the CEO gets paid, we don't see any positive effects there. Like the effects are more or less zero. So this perception of meritocracy, we feel, is probably very important. And there is at least one paper that came out recently by Erika de Serrano and co-authors, where they sort of test this hypothesis more directly. They do an experiment where, much like in our experiments, they reveal some information about how much you can get paid in the more managerial position. But what they also reveal is how the promotions are decided. So they cross-randomize that. In one group, they tell them, like, look, it's up to the boss discretion to decide who gets promoted and who doesn't. So they sort of hint at the fact that it's not meritocratic at all, that you may get promoted, based on whether the boss likes you or not, and not based on whether you work hard or not. Whereas in the treatment group, in the meritocratic group, what they tell them is like, look, we're going to look at the metrics, and whoever worked the hardest, whoever has the best metric, we're going to promote that person. And then what they show is that the effects of revealing the boss pay are positive, but only in the group that was like had the meritocratic treatment. So it's kind of a combination of bosses get paid a lot, and you can aspire to that position that gets people to work harder. So that's one concrete example where they show that meritocracy really matters. My best guess, especially for the horizontal inequality, there may be some cultures where people are more or less like upset about information and so on and so forth. There is a lot of like, and Iris, I think you have some of this research, like looking at like lab experiments in the dictator game, ultimatum game, and so on and so forth. So I'm not an expert on the topic. You probably have like better thoughts than I have. But my best guess is that these are close to moral universals, where it's like, most cultures like kind of think that it's unfair that people get paid differently for the same work. So in that sense, my best guess, it would be a matter more of like a degree that, the effects could be stronger in cultures where they put a lot more, weight on, that type of unfairness versus others. But probably to some extent, it's going to be true across cultures. But that's pure speculation.
No, thank you. And I mean, my sense of the literature in our own work is that inequality aversion, the horizontal comparison, is possibly more generalizable than the vertical. I think that's your intuition too, because right, the vertical is very much linked to people's beliefs in meritocracy and also in just acceptance of pay differences, which we know, for example, in many European countries is the appetite for huge pay differences is much smaller than in the United States, for example. So I think your answer is actually quite directly tied to the first question that Elizabeth asked on how we measure performance. I don't know whether you have actually looked at this at all, but it's related to the experiment that you just talked about. So how do we think about performance metrics? So clearly, sometimes we have more objective metrics available, how many shovels you produce. But then mostly, particularly in white-collar work, the work that you just described in your financial services company, it's subjective performance appraisals. And so I think the question is that something that we should think about, or does transparency have more or less value depending on how we evaluate performance?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And it also relates to another study, that the evaluation of the experiment, where they try to get at that. So this is a study by Suprit Kaur and two other co-authors. I'm blanking on the names right now. Yogita and the third one. Okay, I forgot for a second. I apologize.
No
But
worries,
they have this
no worries.
experiment where they set up a company and they hire people to do some like repetitive job. And then they do an experiment where they tell them like the person that you are working with, they put them in pairs. Is this person getting paid more or less than you? And they also cross-randomize what they tell you about the reason for that. So to some people, they say, hey, this person was more productive in the past, so they're getting paid more because of that, versus if they don't give you that explanation. And that seems to matter a lot. When you think about the equal work part, it's my best guess is that if you pay people unequally based on performance, people are going to be a lot more okay with that. The issue is that for many positions, measuring performance is so hard that you can really do that. And if you do it with subjective evaluations, people can find ways of finding it unfair. It's precisely because it's subjective, you can say, oh, my coworkers are getting paid 10% more because they got better reviews, but the reviews are BS. I work as hard as they did. Just the boss doesn't like me, and so on and so forth. So, and that's kind of like rings true with what we see in the pay data across the world. So I've seen some studies where they try to look at, for example, what percent of pay for workers is commission-based versus base salary. And what you find like all over the place is that the vast majority of pay tends to be base salary, with some exceptions, specific companies, specific positions where performance pay is very high. For the vast majority of employees across the world, base pay is like the main form of compensation. So I think it may be related to this, that for the vast majority of the positions, they just don't have a metric that people will perceive as trustworthy enough to load a lot of the pay in that.
Yeah. So I have to make a quick comment here. I'm astonished that you found a financial services company that allowed you to run the experiment that you ran. That's amazing, right? That they were allowing you to share peer data and the boss's data. In any case, I'm just amazed, and good for you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And one of the things that, for example, the company learned through this exercise is that they should be more open about the promotion opportunities in the company. So one of the things that I found out within these experiments is that they were having an issue with attrition. Some employees were leaving and regretted attrition, employees that they wish they had stayed. And then what was going on is that the employees were getting offers that were quite competitive or a little bit higher than they were currently making. And they were saying like, well, they pay me more money, I'm gonna just leave. One of the things I found out is that, look, if you're just more transparent with employees, that if they stick around for 2 or 3 or 5 years, they could get promoted to this position and they could get paid a lot more, not just a little bit more. The employees are more likely to stick around. So that's one of the takeaways that the company had. And this is like a nice example where, rather than seeing transparency as a tug of war between, or like a zero-sum game between employers and employees, this is a situation where it ended up being sort of a win-win situation. The employees are better off because now they know better about their, promotion potential and how much they can get paid at the company. They can make a more informed decision. But also the employers are better off because by being more transparent about the vertical inequality, they were more likely to retain these employees that they really wanted. So maybe we shouldn't see pay transparency as a zero-sum game between employer and employees. Maybe there are some situations in which they both stand to gain transparency policies.
And I think that's really one of the big pluses of the work that you have done, that many of us have been focusing very narrowly on the pay gap. But there are lots of dependent variables that we might be interested in, including job satisfaction, productivity, turnover, as I just said. But that takes me to the next question. Antea asks about the difference. I mean, first of all, was there a difference between coaching and information only treatment? So we're now talking about your last experiment. And if so, what happened? Do we know anything that happened? What happened during the coaching? Is it confidence or any other speculation that you might have?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So what we find is that it's the information treatment ended up ended up being a lot more effective at just getting people to negotiate. So if you look at, like, for example, what we see like in the control group at baseline, what we see is that only half of the people were attempting to negotiate offers, even though for those who do attempt to negotiate, the returns could be super high. Like half of them were getting at least something in return. And in many cases, it was a 10% increase, a 15% increase, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, it was a bit of a puzzle. Like, why don't people negotiate all the time? And the information treatment seems to be closing that gap, that some people were not negotiating because they thought that the offers that they were getting were take it or leave it offers, that they were not supposed to negotiate, that the employer would like, there would be some backlash and so on and so forth. When in fact, those instances are very rare. The vast majority of employers are opening to negotiating the terms. So by just like fixing that like information friction or information gap, it seemed that a lot more people were like willing to at least attempt a negotiation, and many of them were successful as well. The other friction that we had in mind was that maybe a lot of people, they maybe knew that they had to negotiate, but they felt that they didn't have the information or the skills or the confidence to negotiate. And if that was the case, that's the reason why they're not negotiating. You would expect that when you give them a coach for so cheap, those are the people who are going to say, oh, now that I have the coach, I'm going to negotiate for sure. But we don't see much evidence of that. What we see is that if you make it cheap enough, people take up the coach, but those tend to be people that would have negotiated anyways. Okay, so they sort of say like, I already decided to negotiate. I'd rather do it with a coach rather than on my own. And they tend to do better in some outcomes, like they're more satisfied with how the negotiation went, and they are more likely to accept the offer. So it seems that the coaches are helping a lot, at least in the decision making. But the lack of a coach is not really like a significant barrier for negotiation. Like, we were very surprised. Like, going in, we thought that, you know, the light touch intervention maybe it wasn't going to be too effective, and the coaching one could be very effective, like getting more people to negotiate. But it turned out to be the other way around. And we also did one of these forecast surveys where we described the experiment to a lot of experts and asked them to predict like what are going to be the effects of this intervention on this outcome and so on and so forth. And it looks like the experts had similar priors to the ones that we had originally as well, that the coaching was going to be very effective at getting people to negotiate more, and the information treatment wouldn't. But this is one of the cases where like the effects were exactly the opposite.
So interesting. So we have more questions than we can answer right now. We have 1 minute to go. I'm going to choose one, Rachel's question, because the EU Pay Transparency Directive just recently came out and is changing everything in the EU. So a quick question, any thoughts on that? I think that the question here also is, what if we compare externally? Because Denmark and Canada that you suggested with us were internal comparisons. Now, what some other directives do, right, is allowing me to know what does MIT offer as compared to Harvard, for example. So how do you think about that? Sorry, very
absolutely.
quick answer because we're basically out of time.
Yeah, so I think we need a lot more research. So, for example, one of the things that we understand is what are the mechanisms, like why are these policies having effects? Is it that the employees are looking up information and they are like complaining, and that's what drives the effects? Or is it that employers anticipate this backlash and they make changes to begin with? Do unions like play a role in like how, you know, the information affects salaries? So we have like a lot of questions, and with the data that we have, it's just not enough. So the hope is that in the next like 5 to 10 years, people are going to be looking at effects in different countries, different policies, and try to understand a little bit better. So rather than thinking of pay transparency as a light switch, it could be either on or off. We can think more about like information disclosure design. Okay, so you have to disclose, okay, what's better to do? Should we disclose individual information? IRIS makes this match for this position at Harvard, or should we do it at the like position levels? Oh, associate professors or full professors at the Harvard Kennedy School make this match. Like, and there are pros and cons of doing it one way versus the other way. So I hope that the direction which the literature moves is that as we get more data from more policies and we have better estimates of these things, we can have a more informative discussions as to exactly how to design these policies, rather than whether transparency should be high or lower. More meaningful discussion of what's the optimal way of disclosing the information.
Well, it sounds like you will have lots of work ahead of you and lots of different policies being implemented as we speak. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, you won't hear the applause, but we really appreciated you joining us today. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to announce that next Monday we'll have Zhuo Zhang, a professor of economics and computer science at Northeastern, joining us for the seminar. She is going to be focusing on hiring, specifically on talent attraction, and will look at auditing algorithms. And with that, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you back next week. Thanks again, Ricardo.
Thank you.